Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture series on macroeconomics, the ISLMFE model. So I'm going to be teaching this series focusing on the ISLMFE model, which is one of the core models in macroeconomics. So the objective of this series, which will span a couple of YouTube videos, is going to be as follows. Number one, my goal is to explain the motivation and the logic or the reasoning behind the ISLMFE model, which is what is the reason we need this model in the first place, what is the purpose of this model, and how this model can be useful to us. Then I want to talk in detail about the different components of this model. So the focus is going to be on understanding the individual constituents of this model and try to build up the model from scratch. Then, once we have the individual components, I'll try to put these components together to construct the overarching model. So we combine the different components to get the final ISLMFE model. And then we try to use this model and show some applications, try to understand what is the purpose that we try to achieve with this model, what kind of insights or policy discussions this model can provide. So these are the four objectives of this lecture series that I'm going to cover in the next few videos. So before I jump to the ISLMFE model, let's first talk about the motivation behind what is the purpose of this model and more generally, what are we trying to do here. So before I start on that, let's try to rethink what is macroeconomics about. So typically the way we think about macroeconomics is we try to compare it with the ideas on the other side of it, which is what we refer to as microeconomics. So we often establish macroeconomics in conjunction with the definition of microeconomics. So we have microeconomics and we have macroeconomics. Broadly speaking, economics has multiple disciplines. It has multiple fields. You have labor economics, gender economics, political economics, development economics. But largely, many of these fields can be divided into two subcategories, micro and macro. And some of you might recall this from your other classes, microeconomics and macroeconomics. The key difference is the scope. Microeconomics focuses on how individual firms and consumers take decisions. For example, how a particular company might try to maximize its profits by setting an appropriate price, or how consumers buy certain quantity of goods and services to maximize their utility. So here the focus is on individual entities rather than collective entities. Macroeconomics, it's the opposite. The focus is on the collective entity. That is, try to understand how does the economy as a whole behave. Instead of focusing on each individual, we combine those individuals together and try to understand what are the rules according to which the economy as a whole behaves. What are those aggregate economic variables that we are interested in? So macroeconomics is primarily the study of these aggregate economic variables. But what do I mean by aggregate economic variables? Aggregate economic variables are nothing but variables that capture the state of an economy as a whole. So, for example, if you want to describe, say, the economy of a particular country, what kind of measures can we use to quantify the nature of the economy, to provide structure to the nature of the economy? And there are a lot of measures that people can use. In fact, if you open any kind of macroeconomics news article, you likely see many of these aggregate economic variables. To show you an example, let's just open a random news articles. Here we have Reuters website, and here we can see a bunch of articles on economics. And if you look at any of these articles, you'll start to find some of these aggregate economic variables. For example, the very first one that you see over here is GDP. GDP is a measure of the economy's performance. It's one of the measures, obviously not the perfect measure, but it's one of the measures that is typically used by economists to compare how big an economy is. That is an aggregate economic variable, and that is something we study under macroeconomics. Similarly, if we talk about GDP growth, here that is also an aggregate economic variable, which is nothing but the growth in the GDP over a certain time. Here you see hike rates to 1.5%. This is referring to interest rates, which are also a macroeconomic variable. Interest rates are plenty. There are many different kinds of interest rates in the economy. There are interest rates on short-term deposits and long-term deposits. There are interest rates by different banks, by the central bank, by the private banks. So there are a lot of different interest rates, but we collectively refer to them as a single interest rate called as the real interest rate. We'll talk about this more in the future, but here the interest rate is sort of the real interest rate that is prevalent in the economy. And here we can also see some other economic variables. For example, here we see inflation, which is a measure of how much price level there is prevalent in the economy, which is another macroeconomic variable. So as you can see, there are a lot of macroeconomic variables that are used by macroeconomics. We can list a few of them over here. So we saw GDP, which is a macroeconomic variable, aggregate economic variable. We have GDP per capita, which is GDP divided by population. We have interest rates, which I refer to as R to refer to real interest rates. I will talk in a minute what is real, what is nominal. Then we have inflation, which I denote with pi e to denote inflation. What else do we have? We also have variables like unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is also a common metric which is used by economists to capture how well an economy is doing. So it's another aggregate economic variable. Like this, we have a bunch of other variables. We have prices, which is related to inflation, which we refer to as P, and so on and so forth. You can create a whole list of multiple variables. And broadly speaking, all of these variables, there are three variables that stand out, sort of the three most important variables, and a large number of other macroeconomic variables can be sort of related to these three main economic variables. And these three main economic variables are Y, R, and P. What is Y? Y is nothing but output. What is output? It is the total amount of output that is produced by the economy in a given period of time, for example, in a year. And this is nothing but the GDP of the economy. So Y captures what is the total GDP of the economy, what is the total output of the economy, which is also equal to the total income generated by all the factors of the production operating within the economy, which is also equal to the total expenditure in the economy. So in macroeconomics, there's this very basic concept called as the circular flow of economy. Circular flow of economy. And what this means is, in an economy, everything flows circularly. So whatever income that the factors of production are earning by providing the different kinds of services is equal to the total amount of output that is generated in the economy, which is equal to the total expenditure in the economy. So these three things are essentially one and the same, and we refer to all of these as the output. Why? One important thing to note here is by output, we refer to as the real output. Real output means that the output is expressed in terms of units of goods. In contrast, we have something called as nominal output. Nominal output is output that is expressed in terms of the price of the goods. There is a key difference between the two. For example, when I say a real output, I mean I'm trying to describe what is the output produced in terms of units of goods. For example, say the output of country X, which I refer to as YX, is equals to 10,000, which means country X produced 10,000 units of a good. But it might not mean that the country X produced $10,000 worth of good. But if I know how much each unit of good is worth, then I can say what is the dollar value of output produced. And that dollar value of output will be the nominal output. So for example, if I say here YX is equals to 10,000 units, I'm saying that economy X produced 10,000 units of output. This is real output. But if I know that each unit is $2, then I can get the nominal output, which is nothing but 10,000 into 2, which is $20,000. And this $20,000 is what we refer to as nominal output. For convention reasons, in this course, whenever we refer to Y, we always talk about real output and not nominal output. So it's always in terms of the units of good produced and not the dollar value of those goods. So that is the first component, which is output. Next, we have the real interest rate, R, which is the interest rate that people receive on their deposits with the banks. And as I said before, there are multiple different kinds of interest rates in the economy. It's not just one kind of interest rate. But usually a lot of these interest rates tend to move together. So it makes sense to just focus on one of these interest rates, sort of like a single reference point, and all of the interest rates sort of follow this reference point. And that one interest rate is what we refer to as real interest rate. R. There's something called as a nominal interest rate, and we will talk more about nominal interest rate in the subsequent lectures. But for now, let's just focus on real interest rate, which is the second component, second most important macroeconomic variable that is often used by economists. And the third variable is called as price, which is quite intuitive. It is what is the general price level prevailing in the economy. Just like real interest rate, prices are also entirely different. Different products have different prices. Prices keep changing over time. So when we talk about a price here, we refer to the general price level, which is sort of like the average price prevalent in the economy at any given point of time. So for example, consumer price index is a common metric that is used, which is basically a collection of certain different goods that people use in the day-to-day lives. And we calculate the average price of that basket of goods, which we refer to as the consumer price index. So this is a measure of the average price or the general price level prevalent in the economy. So these are the three main components, Y, R, and P. And every other macroeconomic variable is somewhat related to these three key economic variables. GDP is just output, real interest rate, nominal interest rate are all related to R. Inflation is also related to price, right? Because inflation is nothing but the change in price. For example, if I tell that the price today is $1 and price tomorrow is $1.1. What is inflation? It is simply the percentage change in price, which is final price minus initial price divided by initial price, which is 10%. So that will be the inflation. So inflation is also determined in terms of the prices. Similarly, we have unemployment. Unemployment is a little more complex. It is determined by a lot of factors, but changes in output and changes in price also determine the changes in unemployment. So unemployment is something that depends on all of these factors. So at the end, every single macroeconomic variable that people use boils down to these three key economic variables in some way or the other. That is why it makes sense to focus on these three economic variables to get a structure of how the economy behaves. And to do this, we have the ISLMFE model. So ISLMFE model is nothing but a macroeconomic construct that allows us to understand how each of these three variables, Y, R, and P, behave. And if you look at the ISLMFE model, there are three parts to it: the IS part, the LM part, and the FE part. These three parts directly correspond to the three economic variables that we talked about. The IS part is to do with the real interest rate, the LM part to do with the prices, and the FE line is to do with the output. So each of these three components of the ISLM-FE model are essentially investigating each of the three macroeconomic variables of interest. And once we figure out these individual components, then we can try to put them together within this whole constructive ISLM-FE framework and try to understand what is the general behavior of the economy as large. Whether changes in one variable affect the other variable. For example, if I change price level, does it affect output and interest rate? If not, what is the reasons, and are they independent? Do they correlate? What is the general relationship between these three variables? All of that can be answered using the ISLM-FE model. To add on, each of these models, each of these individual components, the IS component, LM component, and FE component, have a market nested within them. And it is within these markets that each of these variables are determined. The IS model, for example, is based on the goods market. So goods market is the market where we can determine what is the value of real interest rate in the economy. It allows us to explain what is the real interest rate prevailing in the economy and what are the factors that can drive changes in the real interest rate. So for that, we will have to look at the goods market. And this is essentially what the IS model does. Similarly, to understand the behavior of prices, we have to look at the money market. The money market allows us to determine what is the price level in the economy and what are the factors that affect the price level. And this is studied within the LM model. And finally, to understand output, the market that we refer to is the labor market. So the labor market is studied under the FE line and under the FE component of the ISLM-FE model, and it allows us to pinpoint what is the output level in the economy and what are the factors that can drive changes in the output. So our objective for the next 3 lectures is to understand each of these markets individually, the goods market, the money market, and the labor market, to understand how each of these individual components, output, price, and real interest rate are determined. This will allow us to develop the foundational IS model, the LM model, and the FE model. And then we can combine them together to get the overarching IS-LM FE model. And then finally, we can try to do some comparative statics on it, try to understand what is the utility of these models, how does it affect the behavior of other economic variables when one of the economic variables, say, output changes. So all of these questions have very interesting answers, and to understand them, we will first have to go through each of these markets and try to get the essence of the individual components. So that's it for the first lecture. In the subsequent lectures, we'll start with a discussion on each of these individual components, starting with the labor market. So thank you for your time and see you in the next lecture.